Okay, so welcome everyone. This is an exciting night for us, not uh, because it's an unusual opportunity to have such experience in this uh, in this kind of setting. You can see, up, I don't know that if he's on my top left, but the Bernie, if you can raise your hand, that'd be great. Commissioner Kerik is one of the most dynamic, undisputed, controversial, and accomplished leaders in law enforcement in the United States. His unparalleled achievement as New York City's police and correction commissioner and his 30-year career in criminal justice field, coupled with his later incarceration, which included time in solitary confinement, has provided Mr. Kerik with a unique and a one-of-a-kind perspective into the U.S. criminal justice system and prison reforms, prompting him to become an advocate for criminal justice and prison reform. We are so pleased to have you, Commissioner Kerik. He has overseen the New York City jail system, including Rikers Island. He's the most decorated police commissioner in the history of New York City. He's rescued people from burning buildings. He's been shot at, stabbed. He saved his partner in a gun battle. He survived the terror attacks of 9/11, and he survived a bomb threat in Iraq and was appointed the interim minister of the Interior in Iraq. He has over 100 awards for public and heroic service, and he's the author of the book From Jailer to Jailed, My Journey from Correction and Police Commissioner to Inmate Number 84888-054. It's a pleasure to have Commissioner Kerik here with us. We also have Mr. Pat Nolan, who is the director of the American Conservative Union Foundation's Nolan Center for Justice, which informs and mobilizes public support for criminal justice reforms based on conservative principles. He's the leader of the Right on Crime Project, a national movement of conservative leaders supporting sensible and proven reforms to our criminal justice system. Policies that will contain prison costs while keeping the public safe. Pat served 15 years in the state legislature in California. 4 of those 15 as the Republican leader. He's been a leader. He was a leader during that time on crime issues and victims' rights. He's been awarded the Victims Advocate Award by parents of murdered children. He was targeted for prosecution for accepting a campaign contribution as part of an FBI sting. He pleaded guilty and served 29 months in federal custody. He's the author of the book When Prisoners Return. And he is now an expert witness in congressional hearings on prison work programs, juvenile justice, prison safety, offender reintegration, and religious freedom. The American Conservative Union Foundation, which is associated with CPAC, named the Nolan Center for Justice in his honor for his unparalleled efforts to reform criminal justice. I am David Leavitt, the Utah County Attorney and candidate for Utah Attorney General. And I am grateful to be here to talk about my belief in the need for criminal justice reform. And the panel discussion today is moderated by Tolman, who's a former U.S. attorney and founder of the Tolman Group, focused on criminal justice reform and public policy. Mr. Tolman appears frequently on multiple media outlets as an expert commentator on prosecution and criminal justice reforms and on public policy. So with that, Brett, I'm going to ask you to take it away and give you the microphone, and away we go.
Great. Thank you. Sure appreciate it, David. I want to extend a special thanks to my friend Bernie Kerik and Pat Nolan. These are 2 remarkable individuals, and you know, it's been a pleasure for me over the last decade. You know, I spent a decade of my life as a federal prosecutor, and I'm proud of the work I did. I put some real bad guys in prison. I was honored that even though Bush put me in as a U.S. attorney, I was honored that Obama would leave me in so that I could work on the prosecution of Brian David Mitchell, the kidnapper of Elizabeth Smart. So I have spent 20 plus years working in the criminal justice system. And for me to rub shoulders with Bernie and Pat, who have served time in the system, Bernie having been law enforcement, it tells you the power of this effort, and it tells you that people from all perspectives. I have been privileged to be friends with Senator Mike Lee, and I say often that he and I, as young, law students, would talk about some of the things we wanted to do in our careers, and Senator Lee would talk about becoming a U.S. Senator, and I just thought he was kidding around, but I guess he was serious about it. And but we've maintained our friendship and our passion for trying to affect change. And Mike has a phrase he uses that he is, he's involved in the reforming criminal justice system, not in spite of being a conservative, but because he's a conservative. And I believe in that. I believe that there's a compassionate and a Christian side to conservatism, and there's also a responsibility to have government operating at high levels. So I think you're all in for a treat, because you're going to hear from Bernie, and you're going to hear from Pat and their experience, and I'll try to chime in with some of my experience. But right out of the gate, I do want to turn to you, Bernie, and I want to maybe have you give a description of what this journey has perspective it has given to you on the need for criminal justice reform in our country, and why a prosecutor is in a position to do that.
Thank you, Brett. And I want to just stress to the viewers, for me to be here with Brett Tolman, have him talk about Mike Lee, Senator Lee. These are two people that I personally I have an enormous amount of respect for, because they step outside the box to look at a problem that a lot of people don't understand, a lot of people don't know. And I got to be honest, I've run the largest police department in the United States. I've run the largest jail system in the United States. When I ran Rikers Island, I averaged about 133,000 inmate admissions per year. I've run some of the biggest drug investigations in U.S. world history. And I've done it all when it comes to being a cop, a correction officer. I've been a warden, if it's in the law enforcement field, a federal agent, I've done it all. So absolutely, I thought I knew the criminal justice system until I was targeted by the US government. And once I was targeted, once I was prosecuted, and once I went to federal prison, I realized I really didn't know as much as I thought I knew, because I honestly just thought, I had a focus of putting bad guys in prison. And I want to, and I say that for a reason, because Brett just, when his introduction, he just said, he's been honored to work in that position and put some really bad people in prison. That's what I was doing. That's what I thought I was doing. And I come to realize, you know what? Bad people that do bad things, they belong in prison, right? But we put way, way too many people in prison that nobody ever thinks about. Because once those prison doors close, the outside world disregards them. They don't think about them. So you have people, first-time, low-level, really low-level drug offenders. We send them to federal prison for 8, 10, 15 years. Something that on the outside, in the outside world, they may get 6 months in jail, or probation, may get sent to a community center to do some alternative sentencing. We're putting people in prison, commercial fishermen that caught too many fish. Somebody enhances their income in a mortgage application. We take people that's convicted of regulatory and civil issues, and we actually have prosecutors that turn those things criminal, and then they put these guys in, or men and women, in prison and turn them into convicted felons. And I'll share with you my personal insight of prison. Prison is nothing but a training ground for thuggery and criminality. That's what it is. It's a school on how to learn how to steal, cheat, lie, manipulate, con, gamble, and fight. Most importantly, fight. What is prison? You have to survive, right? So I always thought they were all bad people in there, really bad people, until I got there and I realized we're putting way too many people in prison that don't belong there. And we need people. We need attorney generals. We need prosecutors that understands the damage that's being done by the system, not only to the men and women that we put in prison that don't really need to go there, but more importantly, to me, what about the families? What about their kids? What about the fact that we take them out of the workforce permanently, because once you're a convicted felon, you lose your ability to go back into the general workforce. Because, you know, I'll give you one good example that I always try to focus on. Any job in the United States, any job that's overseen by a regulatory body, for example, New York City is overseen by the Trade Waste Commission for sanitation. So if you want to be a garbage man in New York City, you can't be a garbage man because you have a conviction on your record, a felony conviction. That's the case in a number of professions all over the country. So we take these good people, decent people that made mistakes, we take them out of the American workforce, we destroy their lives personally, financially, professionally, and then we send them back home. And we think for some reason it's better for society. It's not. And I can't stress to you enough how important it is that we have attorney generals and prosecutors that understand the damage, and they do something about it. And in this case, I think that's what's being done just in this forum right here.
Hey, Bernie, I used to give a speech while I was U.S. attorney. I became very, quickly aware of how much power I had as a prosecutor. I did it for about a decade. And the criminal statutes just in the federal system blew up from a few hundred under Reagan to over 5,000 presently, criminal statutes, but over 300,000 regulations with criminal penalties. I used to tell companies and people that I would give talks to, give me any company, any person in this country, any executive, and I'll find a crime. I could find a crime and prosecute you under the federal system. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't bad guys that need to be prosecuted, but what we've done is we've swung that pendulum so far that now our resources are limited, our ability to rehabilitate is gone, and we're warehousing people without the need to. So Pat, I'll turn to you, and you've seen firsthand what prosecutors can and can't do. Why is it so vital that we're now having this discussion about criminal justice reform in relation to a prosecutor's role?
Well, a little background. I grew up on Crenshaw Boulevard, a very rough neighborhood, and myself and all my family were victims of crime. And when I got elected to the legislature, it was my intention to try to get the bad guys off the street, like Bernie said. And I assumed that our resources were going to that. Then the FBI started an investigation of me, and all my colleagues, Democrats as well as Republicans, said, well, he's a clean guy, he's good. What I didn't realize was they reached their conclusion and then looked for evidence to do that. And that's totally contrary to the way I understood the system was. One of my colleagues in the assembly became district attorney of his county. And he was proud of saying, in law school, they said that a prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich for a crime. He said, well, that's an everyday prosecutor. He said, an everyday prosecutor can convict somebody that's guilty of a crime. A truly great one can convict an innocent person for a crime. Now, that's really eye-opening because he viewed it as a game. He was going to win at all costs, and we've set aside morality. And so my wife and I really felt betrayed, the system that we believed in. We need prisons. There are bad people that need to be separated from us. But, gee, this machine was just churning up more and more lives. And people don't realize that incarceration harms families. Oftentimes, the children get, frankly, less to eat. It's more difficult for the wife to make ends meet, but also they're missing one of their parents. And we all know that, God created us so you need both parents, but they're separated from their families. And while, yes, we do need people that are really bad separated, but so many of these folks are just low-level folks. One of the things we say is prisons are for people who are afraid of, but more and more we're filling them with people we're just mad at. And one last thing, I was really blessed to work with Chuck Colson, who really brought Christian ministry into prisons to a whole new level. And he and I both said, so we looked around and, these weren't, the people we were incarcerated with weren't the type that we would normally have been among, but they were our brothers. And in first chapter of Peter, he says, for a time, God became a little lower than the angels, so he would not be ashamed to call us his brothers. And I looked around at these low-level folks and thought, they're my brothers, and we need to do something to help them, to help their families. Why on earth is the automatic response to any crime, no matter how minor, incarceration? How about trying to leave them in the community with their family? These, again, are non-dangerous people, and let them do community service. Let them go to drug addiction counseling. Anyway,
Pat, I think you hit on an important issue, and I got involved in this effort maybe 10 plus years ago, and my first experience really was seeing what they were doing in Texas. And Texas was at a crisis point. They wanted to maybe not incarcerate as many people because the budget was going to be difficult, and they started making some changes. They focused on lowering risk of recidivism, on giving incentives to people to get out. And they're not perfect. There's no office that's doing it perfect, but they closed multiple prisons. They ended up not building some prisons that they planned, and they saved over $8 billion. And I thought, if Texas can do this, then we can start to get conservatives. And I notice that conservatives, when they engage on this, they might start out because they're interested in the dollars, but they then start to see the human side, like you've raised, the humanity. And I'd love for us to keep our humanity, because as a prosecutor, you don't have that connection and that touch with the community. You're more like a surgeon. You come in, you think you're doing what you're supposed to, you're right, and nobody's going to tell you that you're wrong, and you make your decisions. And I'm here to tell you that I've seen wrong prosecutions, wrongful convictions. Prosecutorial discretion is driven often by numbers or by something else. And that day and age where, Ed Meese used to call prosecutors who turned down a case and congratulate them for exercising their discretion and not bringing a case. And we at times seem a long ways away from that.
Brett, one thing about Texas, they not only saved a lot of money, but the crime rate dropped to the lowest point since the mid-70s. Okay, that's our
great point.
People. We want to keep them safe, but over-incarceration isn't making them safe, and it's costing them a lot of money. So Texas showed we can lower the number of prisoners by being, choosy about who goes to prison, and we can do that while still keeping the public safe.
David, you look like you wanted to make a comment there. I might have stepped on your comment. Sorry about that.
No problem. I was a very young elected county attorney. I was 31 or 2 years old in a very rural county in Juab County. And I learned this lesson as a sitting prosecutor. The Highway Patrol had been using that stretch of highway in my county for drug interdiction. And they scooped up a kid, an 18-year-old kid from Montana, with 2 pounds of marijuana that he'd purchased in California, and he was going to take it up to the University of Montana to sell and make a few extra dollars. And his defense attorney, his public defender, came into my office because he wanted me to meet with him personally, and I agreed. And I looked at this kid, and I gotta say to you, the very first words that came to my mind was, really, why is this my problem? I'm a small county prosecutor. He's going from California to Montana. Now we're going to pay to prosecute him. We're going to pay to house him. We're going to do all this stuff. And I thought, well, I can just put him, I can put the brand across his forehead that says felon, give him his 90 days and send him off to Montana, and, I'll be done. I'll move on to the next case. It's just like stamp and move on, and then I had a bit of an epiphany when I realized that my role as the elected prosecutor isn't to prosecute people, it's to protect my community and make the community better. And so as I sat there looking at this kid, I realized, well, sometimes you have to prosecute people, sometimes you don't, but that's the aspect of prosecutorial discretion that gives a prosecutor who sees the humanity and the potential and the need for community protection. That's what gives a prosecutor that has that mindset such incredible capacity. And I said to this young man, I said, first off, tell me about your family. He said, do you have a mom and dad? He said, yeah, I do. And he said, well, okay. And I asked that because success in the criminal justice system goes way up if you have someone that's supportive of helping you get through it. And I said, listen, I said, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he said, I kind of like to join the Coast Guard. And I said, well, I got to say, I know you're only 18 years old, but you're really not on the path to get on the Coast Guard with 2 pounds of marijuana going from California to Montana. And he said, it's a stupid thing. I didn't think that through. And I said, well, I'll tell you what. I said, I'm going to give you option number 1. I'm going to give you option number 2. Option number 1 is I'm going to put a felon across your forehead, and I'm going to give you 90 days in jail, and I'm going to send you on your way, and you can live your life in Montana however you want to live it. Option number 2 is you're going to get on this telephone right here. You're going to call Dad, and you're going to say to him, Dad, there's this place called Juab County in Utah, and I just got busted here with 2 pounds of marijuana. And after you make that phone call, you're going to turn back around, you're going to go back to California, you're going to find the nearest recruitment agency, and you go and enlist in the Coast Guard. If you'll do that and send me your pay stub, send your pay stub to your dad, and your dad will fax it to me. You do that for 36 months, this 2 pounds of marijuana will dismiss, and you won't have any kind of record whatsoever. Well, he took option number 2. We called his dad. It was a tough conversation. He went back to back to California, enlisted in the Coast Guard. And I started to look forward to this kid's paychecks every month, because it was my first real experiment in trying to utilize the power of prosecution to benefit a life and in turn benefit the community. And every month I get a fax. This was back in the days of fax, and I'd look at it, and it was, I got these for like 27 months, and on month like 27 they changed. His pay went up because he'd been made a sergeant in the Coast Guard. And I've often wondered to myself, what would this man's life have looked like had there not been a small town prosecutor willing to take a risk on him? And what would it look like? What would society have looked like without this sergeant in the Coast Guard, rather than just having some other convicted felon? And people often say to me, well, Leavitt, that's great for you to do that in a small town, but how can you do that in a large place? And I say it has nothing to do with the size of the geography of the jurisdiction. It has to do with the size of the heart of the prosecutor and the willingness to deal with the humanity that's all around us. And so, that's what we're trying to do here in Utah County, is recognize the humanity of everyone with whom we deal, because that's how we'll solve our problems.
You know, you raise, and I know there's a couple of you, I'll be real quick, but you raise an issue, and I see a couple of comments from panelists that are listening. You know, there's probably not a more vulnerable time for prosecutors. Things are going to change because the public is starting to see, you know, there's people in the government that seem to be getting away with things there and not getting prosecuted. You've seen what happened in the FBI. You've seen some of the misconduct at the highest levels of the government. You see prosecutors are, you know, for the first time, there's people that are starting to second guess the credibility of the decision making of the prosecutor. I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing because they still are. They're still so protected. We need major changes, like immunity has to be brought down and put within reason so that there's repercussions for bad decisions. There needs to be more accountability to prosecutors. But setting those aside, you know, Bernie, and what reforms are out there that you think a prosecutor could implement or should implement?
Yeah, Brett, I want to touch on a couple of things, but first, I don't know if Dave knows this, but Mr. Leavitt, I will tell you that story is a national story. I had no idea that was you. I've heard that story at probably 5 different conferences when it comes to prosecutorial discretion and what you could do to help somebody, what you can do to destroy them. That is an example I've heard at least five different opportunities in all over the country. So I'm glad to know that you're with the guy behind it.
That was me. I only have one regret. I don't remember his name.
That's okay. That's okay, because I've heard this story. So,
Thank you.
but that's number one. Number two, to get to talk about Brett's comment just now, and somebody on here, they're asking, you know, what do you think of prosecutorial overreach and overzealous prosecutions? So I'm gonna tell the viewers this, and I'll let Mr. Leavitt speak for himself. But I am no different today of a law enforcement, aggressive cop mentality type person than I was 25 years ago. I'm no different today. The only difference is today I know the system much better than I did before. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if I went to a wedding with my family and I was sitting at a table with 4 other couples, and you had somebody at that table that talked about a prosecutor, or talked about the FBI and said that they were corrupt or they were engaging in misconduct, I would be the guy sitting at that table saying, that's outrageous. Doesn't happen. Absolutely does not happen. You don't know what you're talking about. But I'm here to tell you today, I would be the guy to chime in and say, you're right. They're not all like that. They're not all like that. But we have seen in the last 24 months, 36 months in Washington, we have seen overzealous prosecutions, selective and political prosecutions, the suborning of perjury, extorting false testimony, all these things. And I have to tell you, as somebody that's been
falsified
through
302 reports,
falsified
things we never thought we'd see.
No, and there's 2 reasons I never thought I'd see it. Number one, I never thought it would happen, and number 2, I'm almost glad that it's happened. As horrible and tragic as it's been and embarrassing for the United States, I will say I'm almost glad it happened. You know why? Because nobody would believe it. Nobody in the country would believe it. They always thought, especially the federal prosecutors, they wore the white hats. Those are the good guys. Those are the guys, perfect records. Now, I have another story on perfect records, but as you're listening to me talk, I want you to think of this. Who really has a perfect record? Business, company, person. Perfect? No, nobody's perfect, right, except for the Department of Justice. So you have to think. But we have seen.
You're not wrong there. I was a brilliant lawyer when I was in DOJ, and then it all fell apart when I left. Because I won every motion I ever filed. I thought I was brilliant.
Well, listen, it's times have changed. Times have changed. And I'm telling you, I think, and this is one of the reasons I agreed to do this, because it's not often today that you get people like Brett Tolman and Dave Leavitt and others who were real prosecutors who want to fix the system and who will stand up and admit, they will admit there's something wrong. There's something wrong and it has to be fixed. We've seen it consistently now for 3 years. So you know, I give Mr. Leavitt a lot of kudos in putting this together. And you can, Dave, you can speak for yourself on what you think of overzealous prosecutions and overreach.
Well, let me say, but Pat had something he wanted to say, and then I'll go in after Pat.
Just quick, we all presumed that they, especially the feds, were straight arrows. I grew up admiring the FBI, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., you know, Kevin Costner, Jimmy Stewart. But in my case, I brought the Republicans within 5 votes of a majority. And some of you may know Willie Brown. Maxine Waters was the majority leader. I was fighting them every day. And lo and behold, 7 weeks before the election, they raid my office and, you know, destroy our campaigns. With Trump, we've seen this unrelenting push. But it's not just what they did to President Trump. They did it to the governor of Virginia, took him out, and he was a straight guy. And of course, it was overturned, but it's too late. They did it to Tom DeLay and took him out. We've developed a point where, this is my final point. Gary Aldridge was a FBI agent that I admire a lot. He wrote the book Unlimited Access. He was the FBI agent assigned to the White House with the Clintons, and he saw all the corruption there. And he said, Pat, it used to be, J. Edgar Hoover was the absolute authority. It was a military type structure. If you were bad, you went to Timbuktu. He said when he left, when Hoover died, both parties said, we're never going to have an FBI director so powerful. And therefore, they put in milk toasts. And what happened is, he said, nature abhors a vacuum. And so without a strong leader at the top, you got all the climbers at the 7th floor of the FBI, and they all wanted to attach themselves to a political rising star so they could make their career. And that explains a lot of what we've seen go on. Blind ambition of these prosecutors, not to serve the people, but to serve their own careers.
Let me jump in and say this, and to keep the noise, to keep the mic interference down, I'm muting me, I'm muting everybody. And so if I see you want to talk, I'll just unmute you. But, you know, the founders, I'd like to just say this, because I think this is the root of our you know, the root of our problem. The founders gave us a government. They gave us a legislative branch to make laws, an executive branch to enforce them, a judicial branch to referee those two. But there's a very significant power that people never gave government. People never gave government the power to take away a fellow citizen's liberty. They retained that to themselves through the jury. Now, the jury was alive and well until the Civil War, and it began to erode through when plea bargains were introduced. By 1969, there were 75% of the plea bargains, 75% of the cases being settled by plea bargains. Today, there's over 99% of the cases that are settled by plea bargains. And what that means is that when you take the power away from people to make that decision, you give it to the elected prosecutor. And so, you know, I'm sitting in this chair right now as the elected prosecutor in Utah's 2nd largest county, and I have full authority to investigate anyone I want to investigate, charge anyone I want to charge. Once I've had my way with him or her, if I are of this sort, then you give them a plea bargain or dismiss the case, because I have 100% complete immunity for my actions. And we have systematically taken away power from people. And to make matters worse, once you connect this awesome prosecutorial power with political ambition, then you have a real serious problem, because then you have someone who can utilize government power with complete immunity and do so for your own benefit. And the problem with plea bargains is that when you're the prosecutor and you're trying to get someplace or become something, you know, every plea bargain is, you know, in the back, you know, every plea bargain has the potential of saying, how's this going to affect me? And once you start to infuse your own self-interest in it, you know, then you're in real trouble. And I will tell you that we are living today, we are either experiencing or about to experience, I should say, what John Adams said. John Adams said, representative government and trial by jury are the heart and lungs of liberty. Without them, we have no other fortification against being ridden like horses, worked like cattle, and fed and clothed like swine and hounds. And it was founder John Dickinson that implored us. It is the duty of every man and woman to maintain to the utmost the jury trial, to restore it to its ancient dignity if it's at all impaired, and above all, to guard it with the most jealous circumspection. The problem is that the prosecutors control the plea bargains. And we do it through what you charge. You make it so painful and so risky that you know, there's a real temptation to plead guilty. And so we, you know, what I'm doing, and it was really, I mean, I ran for this office because I wanted to reform the criminal justice system. But after I took the oath of office and swore to uphold the Constitution, and it started to work on me that part of that Constitution that I swore to uphold was the right to a jury trial. And I realized that's really where it's at. And, you know, we can't try every case. The plea bargain is going to be around for all of our lifetimes, but we can reduce, well, and for crying out loud, the plea bargain is how we got the Coast Guard story. You know, I mean, there's a lot of good that comes out of plea bargains, but we have to reduce what we charge. We have to start charging things so that we charge with an eye towards trying it rather than an eye towards settling.
You know, I really like, you know, that statement, because it's theoretically how it's supposed to work. What we've seen is, you know, decades under the Clinton administration, for example, the crimes that the legislature passed expanded our criminal statutes in the federal system, making it so that the plea bargain became this necessary tool that if you didn't utilize it, you would be you'd be a prosecutor that was deficient, because you would not get to the number of cases that you needed to, and you might not address some of the issues and be able to help the victims. Plea bargaining became very, very important. But I go back even before that, and I say one of the problems is because we saw politicians started to believe that you were only a good politician if you could one up the other on being tough on crime. So we had decades of going this one-upmanship that occurred. Democrats and Republicans did it, and they increased the number of crimes and they increased the penalties on those crimes, and we did it for decades. And now we're dealing with a system that is the most punitive system, warehousing, you know, millions of individuals that otherwise do not have to be prosecuted. And I now am hearing from friends that while we're under, this coronavirus and stay at home, and various states have different orders in place, friends that have been opposed to criminal justice reform are reaching out and saying, are you seeing they just arrested that guy on the paddleboard in California? Can you believe this? And I said, welcome to criminal justice reform. It's so great to have you. You're starting to see that there's effort that needs to take place. We can all do it. And I see two people, Pat Nolan, Bernie Kerik, two tremendous people. I would love to be able to spend, time with them. I love for them to spend time with my family. They are truly remarkable men that I would love for them to, you know, mentor my sons because they're great people, but yet they've gone to prison. The sad part about the federal system is you have to rely on a presidential pardon or a commutation in order to get that conviction behind you. There's no expungement. There's no restoration of rights that's been funded. And so a lot of people don't realize that. But the states, that's why I argue states, these positions are important because they can do things the federal government is failing to do. And so I'd like to hear from Pat and Bernie on their thoughts because, you know, they're two people that got incredibly lucky. I mean, when I say lucky, it's lottery type odds that they got lucky and got, you know, a commutation or a pardon. And I'll let them talk about that. But I want to see us not have to rely on something so extraordinary for people to be able to move on from a conviction.
Let me start, Pat. I'm a couple things. When you say lucky, that's not even, I don't even know what the word is. It's beyond lucky. And I think Pat's in the same boat that I was. Both of us were, you know, very aggressive in fighting for the First Step Act, fighting for the Second Chance Act under the Obama administration. You know, for the past 6 years, I actually work with Pat. That's how I met him, working on criminal justice reform in the Obama administration. And I have to tell you, when President Trump was elected, I had people actually call me and they said, listen, if President Obama couldn't get this done, this guy, President Trump, is not going to get it done. So you can just give it up until he leaves office. And ironically, 2 years later, Pat and I and Brett, all of us were there when President Trump signed into law the First Step Act. Probably one of the most substantial pieces of criminal justice reform legislation in the past 3 decades. And, you know, if it wasn't for that in my record, I don't think I would have been pardoned. But to Brett's point, and this is extremely important, the states have enormous ability to do things that you can't do in the federal system. Nobody knows that better than Governor Perry. And what he did in Texas, you know, closing prisons, expunging records, getting their records back in order so they can get their, you know, their constitutional and civil rights restored. You have hunters that used the wrong ammunition, that shot an animal or had the wrong butt of a gun or something, charged with a felony, convicted, and they can't hunt for the rest of their lives. They didn't go out and kill a person. They didn't murder anybody. They didn't do anything. It was a hunting issue.
Yeah.
For the rest of their life. Can't hunt. You know, states can fix that. The attorney generals of states today have enormous power to fix things, these wrongs that have been going on for decades. They have enormous power. And I would urge Dave and others like him, prosecutors that understand the issues. These are things that you have to work on. And I'll let Pat touch on the clemency pardon issue.
Yeah, since you know, the Magna Carta, executive authority to grant clemency has been part of the executive function. It's in the natural course of business, there needs to be a flywheel to help balance in case the system becomes too punitive. And unfortunately, over the years, the Department of Justice has tried to infringe on that, setting up this process, which basically says they never make any mistakes and therefore no one gets pardoned. Up through Nixon, the pardons were part of the routine job of being president. They issued hundreds of them. Eisenhower did, Kennedy some, he was only in briefly, Johnson, Nixon, they all pardoned people. It was part of the normal thing. Since then, we've gotten away from that. And that's really unfortunate because we do need a balance wheel. When the system is out of balance, we need the executive to be able to say, nah, this has gone too far. A lot of us are working on a system that will establish outside the Department of Justice a way to review convictions, and see what they've done with their lives since and things like that. I think it's only normal, and it's been abnormal that we have restrained that power or limited it. I've got a humorous story to tell. I was an avid hunter. I was also a reserve deputy sheriff for 20 years with the LA Sheriff Department, always a marksman or higher and qualifying. And other than losing my right to vote, it really hurt that I couldn't protect my family and I couldn't have a weapon. And so when President Trump called to tell me he was going to pardon me, I, of course, was very, very grateful to him. And I said, and you give me a full and complete pardon restores my Second Amendment right. I can now protect my family with the gun. And he paused a minute and he said, well, don't do anything crazy. And that was so typical of President Trump that, he's very practical. Oh, well, gee, you get a gun, don't do anything crazy. But this is his tender heart that a lot of people don't see. But it shouldn't depend on that. The system should. In fact, some of us have recommended that there be a Forgiveness Friday or Mercy Monday, that just routinely dozens of pardons and commutations are issued as part of the routine process of the executive branch. We're a long ways from that, but in the states, they have the ability to do that. What about an attorney general that might prepare packages to send to the governor to consider? I think in Oklahoma, they're trying to set up a process like that to help the governor be more willing to, and frankly, to have more facts for him. Not biased the way the DOJ is, that they do everything right, but instead giving the executive a good workup on it. So that's definitely a reform that we need.
Well, Pat, I don't think one of the surprising things for me was when I first started getting involved in criminal justice reform is educating legislators, whether it's on the state or the national level. There's such a perception, maybe it's the Law and Order, maybe it's all the Hollywood, maybe it's something else. There's such a perception that we always get it right. We prosecute bad guys. It's just loaded with bad guys. Like Bernie said early on, you get in there and then you start to see it's not exactly what you thought it was. I had a conversation with a very close friend of mine is a drug prosecutor for his entire career, and he's now a state judge. And I asked him, I said, in your career, how many times did you put away a true kingpin drug dealer, bad guy? How many times? And he said one time during his 30 some odd years of prosecuting cases. And a lot of people don't realize, for every, Al Capone that might be in the system, there's far more that are low-level addicts that can lead a totally different life once they're off the drugs, or there's financial crime, or there's individuals with little or no criminal history. One of my closest friends in this in criminal justice reform is Sean Hopwood, professor at Georgetown Law School and former federal bank robber. And now he's a professor, and so I believe in the redemption of humanity. I believe that prosecutors have gone too far. That doesn't mean there aren't terrific ones out there, but I think it's up to the system. And I think it's an attorney general and a county attorney can be very valuable in educating the legislatures of their states in order to see and understand what the system is and to identify what can be changed. Bernie?
Yeah, you know what? That's a really good point, Brett. The education part of this, I think we need people to get to the legislators, and whether it's prosecutors or attorney generals from different states, we need people to get to the legislators to basically explain to them what's going on in prison. And I can tell you, I spent 3 years and 11 days in a minimum security camp. I spent 60 days in solitary confinement. And I can tell you in that time, only an hour and a half from Washington, D.C., not once ever did I see a member of the judiciary, did I see anybody from the House or the Senate walk through that federal prison that they oversee, basically. Not once did I ever see them walk through the prison, walk into the camp, walk through a dormitory and say, hey, what are you doing here? What do you do all day? What were your charges? What was your indictment and what did you plead to? Because those are two big different things, right? They don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. They know what some staffer thinks, and they base their decisions on what those staffers think. They don't base their decisions on reality. And educating them, it is so, so important for them to know exactly what's going on. So Brett, that in itself to me is a really, really important part of this, because without somebody educating them, they're making decisions on the future of this country, on people's livelihoods, on families, and they don't even know what they're talking about.
Twice during my career as a prosecutor, I was wrongfully prosecuting an individual that I'm aware of. Now, I was in my 30s, and you know, in your 30s, you're rarely wrong. You know, but I was fortunate to have a defense attorney that called me up and said, hey, I think you've got this one wrong, and will you sit down with me? And she did a good job of presenting to me. And then I asked the FBI to follow up, and they found some evidence that suggested she was accurate. And then the other one was, I thought I was 100% right. Bernie and Pat, I thought I was 100% right. I had the right guy. He fit the description. There was circumstantial evidence that pointed to him. And he called me up and asked to meet with me. It was the only defendant I ever prosecuted that asked to meet with me. And it was odd. So it's kind of like visiting the prisons. And I said, okay. So I went in there, and he confessed to several robberies, but he said, this one I didn't do. And I looked to the FBI agent after the meeting and I said, does it bother you that he admitted to all these other robberies, but not this one? And he said, oh no, he's a dirtbag. He just doesn't want to go to federal prison because it's tougher. And I said, no, it bothers me. Will you start digging into this and what he alleges, you know, happened? Sure enough, we had it wrong, and we had already presented the case to the grand jury. We just hadn't arrested him and issued the indictment, but we had it wrong. It turns out he was not the guy that did that. So I like that when we understand our you know, fallibility and perhaps that allows us to make some changes. David, last word probably.
Well, I just wanted to say this. I'm going to say something very quickly, but I'd like Bernie to tell the Marine story going to prison because that's quite a striking story. And if you'd each take 60 seconds or 120 seconds and tell us what it was like to receive a telephone call from the President of the United States and to be pardoned, I think that would be interesting too. But before I close, and I'll give one of you three the final word. I want to emphasize this, that in my 30 years of experience in the criminal justice system, either as a elected prosecutor, I was elected prosecutor before, as you know, in my nearly 30 years in the criminal justice system, the vast majority of police officers with whom I've dealt are good men and women who value truth, who are honest, who are hardworking, and who truly want to protect our society. And that's the same for the vast majority of prosecutors. Now, there's a bad apple in the bunch here and there on both of these, but that's not the real danger. The real danger isn't, you know, someone being a rogue. I'm going to just do something that benefits me. The real danger is when we are so convinced that we're right, that we're not willing to consider that we could be wrong. And that becomes part of the problem. And part of my effort as the county attorney is to expand the perspective of my prosecutors and expand the perspective of the law enforcement officials in my jurisdiction, because they are good people. But never in American history have prosecutors or police had such a bad image. And it's something that we need to change. And when law enforcement gets on me about my stance on criminal justice reform, I just look at them and I say, guys, I'm trying to help you here. I'm trying to draw you toward what people think. If you're going to be critical of me in the media, just make sure you spell my name right, because the people understand this. We're the ones that need to draw towards them. And having said that, I'll turn the mic over to Pat and Bernie for my favorite request.
So here's my story. You know, I said earlier that prison is a training ground for thuggery and criminality, and when you send the wrong people there, you turn them into thugs. So about 6 months into my time in Cumberland, Maryland, we got a United States Marine. He came in. He was given an 18-month sentence because he sold a pair of night vision goggles on eBay. And unfortunately, the person he sold them to didn't have the right permit to sell them internationally. So they took this kid. He pled guilty on a conspiracy with somebody he didn't even know because he sold these night vision goggles. When he walked into the camp, I knew he was a Marine before he even told us. His green fatigues were starched. His boots were shined like glass. He had a Marine haircut. He yes sir'd and no ma'am'd and yes ma'am'd everybody on the camp. He was a Marine. Well, I was there 14 months later when he left. He left a thug. His pants were hanging off of his bottom. He walked out in sandals. He was talking all kind of junk to everybody around him. We took a kid that was a really good kid that made a mistake. He didn't even know he made a mistake. He didn't even know what he did wrong. We took that kid, we turned him into a convicted felon, and we destroyed his life until the day he was about 23 years old, 22 years old. He's going to be a convicted felon until the day he dies if he lives to be 100. And it's going to destroy his personal, professional, and his financial life. For what? It was wrong. As for my experience with the president's call on the pardon, I have to be honest. He called me, told me that he was in the process of signing my unconditional and full pardon, and I personally broke down. It was so overwhelming to me, and I know the president. I've known him a long time. I've known him since 1995 or 6. I've known him a long time. He's a friend. But when he spoke to me as the president to tell me he was restoring my rights, I can't even tell you what the conversation was because I was too emotional to remember. So it meant a lot to me.
You know, it was beautiful, and it was emotional for me too, just knowing you, Bernie, for the time I have and what it meant and the contrast in your life from going to, you know, the largest police force chief, you know, in the country to the full pardon. It was an honor to watch it. Pat?
Thank you.
You know, his father loved him. He was his favorite and had the many-colored coat, and his brothers stole the coat and threw him down a well, hoping to kill him. Then they sold him into slavery, and he ended up, he was so talented, he was the vizier to the pharaoh. And when his brothers, because the Israelites were starving, they needed grain. When they were before him, they were so frightened he'd kill him. And he said, no, what man intended for evil, God intended for good. And I really feel while it was terrible and painful to go through what I did, and especially for my dear wife, and my children were 5, 4, and 10 months old when I went in. But God used it, and I'm really grateful for that. And I had a chance to, I don't know, I think I'm probably the only convicted felon that's been in the White House Oval Office 4 times for signing important legislation. And when President Trump called me, I was stunned. In fact, I just
Well, you know that streak is over, Pat. That streak's over.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's done it 4.
Yeah. I I almost didn't take the call because I thought it was one of my friends punking me. But I did, and they suddenly the president came on, and it was very humbling, and I'm very grateful for it. But I also know there's so many others deserving of a pardon that are piled up waiting to be acted on. I really hope we can change it for the little folks that don't have the access that Bernie and I had. Just one thing to think about with all the exonerations we've had. I know one fellow is on death row in Texas, 10 years, and the DNA proved it wasn't him, but he could have been executed before then. And there's so many deserving cases that need to be looked at. So Brett, I appreciate so much. You have such credibility as a prosecutor. And David, you do, that you're courageous for speaking out and addressing the flaws in the system, but more important, offering solutions, showing us a way out rather than just complaining. So my hat's off to you, and I hope that people realize the great opportunity it is to have prosecutors who really believe in justice rather than winning.
Thank you to you both. David, last word.
Thank you, Brett. You know, a stock certificate's a piece of paper, and it evidences value of something greater. And I like the phrase that when you convert that piece of paper to money, that stock certificate, you redeem it. You redeem something of little value to something of tremendous or more value. I also like the fact that, you know, the word in this context, you know, 2018, the University of Virginia men's basketball team became the laughing stock of NCAA basketball when they became the first #1 seed to lose to a 16 seed. They lost to, you know, University of Baltimore County, Maryland, badly. The next year in 2019, they were a #1 seed again, and I love this phrase. They redeemed themselves. They won the national championship. I favor the phrase, and it's a phrase that I coin, and, you know, that I use everywhere. Instead of using the phrase restorative justice, which takes us back to where we were to begin with, and oftentimes that's not a very good place. I like the phrase redemptive justice. #1, because it allows us to help the defendant, and quite frankly, we have the opportunity to do so for the victim. But again, we're not talking about violent crime. We're talking about this non-violent crime. We have the opportunity to help the defendant to redeem them into someone of greater value than they were. But what I like the most about this phrase redemptive justice is that as a society, we need to redeem ourselves for how poorly we have dealt with our criminal justice system and with our own people. There is no shame. There is no shame in acknowledging the problem that we have. But there's tremendous shame if we are not willing to look at it head on and deal with it with courage and resolve. And, you know, our system, you know, it's interesting that we go to war in World War II, to Europe and to Japan, and then we turn around and rebuild their countries. We did the same in Iraq. You know, we are this compassionate, we have this history of compassion and humanity, yet we are at war with our own people. No one should be more compassionate and more helpful to its own people than the United States of America. And I believe that we'll get there. I believe that we'll learn from our mistakes, that we'll acknowledge them, and that we indeed will redeem ourselves. And I just want to express my gratitude to the three of you for being willing not only to be here tonight, that's big for me, and I love that. I'm grateful for it, and we're going to send this to every state delegate multiple times because I want them all to see it, not because simply of my candidacy, but because people need to understand, which is why I'm running. People need to understand what, the problem we have. But I want to thank you for devoting your lives to serving this country. And I believe that you are serving this country when you were learning what you were learning in prison, for the two of you. And it takes a lot of humility and a lot of courage to say that you've prosecuted people wrongfully. And I believe that you three will continue to gather a band of men and women around you, and together we will change this system. And so my hat's off to all three of you, my gratitude to all three of you, and I will say thank you. It's 10 o'clock in New York City, 7 o'clock, I suppose, in Prescott, Arizona. But God bless you all, and have a good night. I'm sorry, my apologies to our questions. We didn't have the opportunity to get questions, but I'll reach out to you by email or by telephone. I got your number here on the delegate list, and we'll go from there.
Thank you.
Thank you.